Welcome to another episode of MissTrial. So excited to see my friends Danya Perry and Kathleen Rice. So we're three former prosecutors, current law partners and friends, really good friends. So here we are chatting about various issues. Today we have three topics we want to talk to everybody about. We want to talk about the upcoming imminent Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity that should happen any minute, any day. It could be as soon as Thursday or Friday of this week. It could be, but it's definitely before the end of this month. And what will happen with respect to all of the cases against Donald Trump that are federal? What would the presidential immunity decision of the Supreme Court, how that would impact that? So we're going to talk about that so everybody's prepared once the Supreme Court rules on this, just a reminder on what the issues are. We're also going to talk about the Alvin Bragg Manhattan DA case, where the sentence is coming up very soon and a gag order was just upheld by New York's highest court. So Donald Trump is still under the gag order. And in addition to being a former prosecutor, Kathleen Rice, we're going to start talking with you, who is a former member of Congress. And a lot has been going on in Congress these days, including the fact that Donald Trump was brought there almost like a hero's welcome by the Republicans, which was his first time there since January 6th. And it struck me as kind of disgusting. And, someone wrote on Twitter, it's take your felon to work day. I thought that was kind of poignant. Yeah, it was a good one. But why don't we just jump right into it? And Kathleen, talk to us. What's going on in your former employer?
Well, ladies, I am so thrilled to be out of the craziness of Washington and here and with you two, not just practicing law, but also opining on all things that are relevant in everyone's day-to-day life. And nothing is more important than the elections this year. And I was thinking about this in 2022. That was the first time my name hadn't been on a ballot in 17 years, which was crazy. Wow. You think when you decide you're going to run for office, it's going to be kind of in and out and you're not going to be there for long. But I was DA for 9 years and then I was in the House for 8 years. And so in 2022 was the first time that I was not on a ballot. But so now here we are in 2024. Again, I'm not on the ballot, but I feel like I can really take a much more objective view of what is going on. And I think it goes without saying that the road to the majority for either the Republicans or the Democrats runs directly through New York. Certainly in 2022, Democrats had control of the House, albeit by a very small margin. And it was because of races that Democrats lost in New York State that the Republicans took control of the House. Now, I want to say that we lost 5 seats in 2022. So we have to make up at least that much ground. And, I'm throwing it out to you ladies too, but I'll, kind of highlight a couple of districts, the ones that I think the Republicans are focusing on. And just so everyone knows, about 20 years, no, not even 20 years ago, it was about 2011 that the Congressional Leadership Fund, it's also known as CLF, was set up by Republicans. And it was a super PAC that was created for leadership, specifically the Republican, whether it be the majority leader or the Speaker of the House, use that super PAC to support candidates in purple districts or in districts where they thought that they could run someone who could beat a Democratic incumbent. And they have raised a ton of money. And this year they're planning on putting at least, from what I understand, about $29 million just in New York. In seats to protect newly incumbent Republicans. So that is my seat, New York 4, where Rep. D'Esposito is running for reelection. You have Molinaro in New York 19. You have Mike Lawler in New York 17. Suozzi won back the George Santos seat in New York 3, so he should be a pretty safe seat. But, Democrats also feel kind of hopeful about New York 1, which is Lee Zeldin's old seat all the way on the east end of Long Island, where there is Nick LaLota is running for re-election. But we have John Avlon, who was an independent until he became a Democrat, who's got huge institutional Democratic support. And look, I don't think he can win that seat, but Republicans feel like they need to protect that seat as well. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. And, Democrats are kind of fighting to run the best candidates that they can as well. The woman running for my old seat, New York 4, is Laura Gillen. She lost. She ran in 2022 and only lost by 4 points in a district that Kathy Hochul, who was running for governor at that time, lost by 20. I mean, can you imagine trying to ride those coattails?
Kathleen, can I ask just a tiny bit, and maybe there's, a whiff of ignorance to this question. I live in New York, and maybe I should know better. But the backstory here is that there was redistricting in the last election cycle, right? And now there's a new map that's been drawn. Can you elucidate any of that? I haven't been totally up to speed, but that has something to do with the loss of the seats, I think, and will play into the next election. That's a really good question, Danya. So gerrymandering is the way that we draw congressional lines, and it's the same way in every state. And in New York, the Democrats were in control of the House 2 years ago. So we and the legislature in New York, which is also responsible for drawing the lines for the Assembly and the State Assembly and the State Senate. And it first has to go through an independent commission. They drew lines. This is 2 years ago, 3 years ago now. They drew lines that were rejected by the legislature. And under the law, then the responsibility of drawing the lines goes to the legislature. And as both sides are wont to do when they have control, they go all the way. And we drew lines that were rejected by, albeit an upstate Republican, judge. But we kind of went a little crazy with the lines to try to make them more blue, obviously, because this is what you want to do, right? But they also have to pass legal muster. And this is why the primaries were pushed back to August, because this was pending in the courts. The Republicans brought this a lawsuit, and they did it in a very remote district upstate. So it was handled by a Republican judge who put a special master in charge of drawing the lines. And they basically favored Republicans in these districts. And of course, we were running, against a tidal wave of messaging about public safety, specifically number 1, 2 years ago, which is why I think Kathy Hochul didn't do as well in the suburbs as she probably should have. So those are the lines that we ran on. And the lines that are drawn now are much more kind of in keeping with the way that they were, with a few tweaks. So my seat became a little more blue because we got the 5th of the 5 towns that make up part of New York 4, Inwood. We got that from Greg Meeks. So I would say that there should be a slight edge for Democrats, but it really all depends on how well Joe Biden does. So in 2020, Joe Biden won New York 4, which is my seat on Long Island, by about 12 points. Now, I don't know where he's going to be this time, but this is another issue that is happening all across the country. You have some really critical Senate races where Democratic candidates, incumbents and non-incumbents, are running ahead of Joe Biden in critical states like Wisconsin. That's not good for Joe Biden, but it's good for us maybe keeping control of the Senate. So there are a lot of moving parts going on here. And, look, you guys are here in New York. I mean, what are the main issues going to be? I mean, immigration is going to be a big issue here in every district throughout New York State. And I think public safety is still a really salient issue, on top of an issue that I think is really going to, I don't think people can really put their finger on the pulse of how this is going to motivate voters, but it has been motivating them in primaries and for special elections and stuff like that, which is the issue of choice. Now, we're here in a blue state where a woman's right to choose is firmly ensconced in the New York State Constitution. But we see what's happening in a post-Roe world where now the states are deciding
what women's access to healthcare is going to be. And it's not a pretty picture.
I mean, it's
so
crazy.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to comment, just pick up on one thread there, Kathleen, and then sorry, Karen, that I jumped in here, but it does seem like at least the Senate, the Democrats are running some strong races in the Senate, but you've got some smarter choices that have been put out there. It seems from the Republican side. I think in the last election cycle, you saw some pretty extremist candidates there, and now it seems like they're more centrist, even being endorsed by the former president. So I haven't followed as closely what's going on in the House races, and maybe that's just Trump sucks so much oxygen out of the political system that everything is about him, and less so on the Senate races. So I'm not really sure if there are more, or I should say less extremist candidates out there for the House races on the Republican side, but that'll be an interesting.
That's a good point, Danya, because if you look at a race that we're waiting to get the outcome for today, Bob Good in Virginia, he's the head of the Freedom Caucus. You cannot get more conservative than that. And he got into a back and forth with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump endorsed his opponent. Now, interestingly, here's a little twist. Also endorsing his opponent is Kevin McCarthy. And Kevin McCarthy is going against Bob Good because Bob Good was one of the Republicans who voted to unseat him as Speaker. So you have Kevin McCarthy and Donald Trump against a sitting incumbent, ultra uber conservative member who I think at last count is winning by like 327 votes. So I think that the message that Republicans writ large are trying to get to, not just within their own caucus in terms of who they're supporting in these races where they're trying to, flip a blue seat to red, they can't run the far right candidates if they want to win in those seats. And I think that Donald Trump might be getting that message as well, because when he endorsed people 2 years ago, it didn't go well for Republicans. There was supposed to be this red wave, and it was really just a trickle.
He's endorsing people like Hogan, right? He's endorsing people like Hogan, right? Who actually criticized him in a way after the
and didn't accept his
that wouldn't have happened 2 years ago.
Yeah. Definitely not. So I think it's really, it's going to be really interesting to see. And, look, I look at New York and people say, oh, it's a blue state. And I think to myself, well, actually, in the races 2 years ago, it ended up being 4 blue counties, that 4 of the 5 counties that make up New York City actually staying blue. And every other seat almost was red. So, and I think that had, in large part was due to, the coming out of the COVID, a lot of people leaving New York and New York trying to come back, and, Republicans just being relentless on the issue of public safety. I mean, if Lee Zeldin talked about public safety once, he talked about it a million times. And that's what Republicans are really good at doing, right? At messaging. Democrats, not so much.
Yeah, that was what I was going to talk about or ask you about was, it's so interesting. So many people think New York is blue, but it really is a mixture depending on where you are. And, I guess I didn't realize how critical New York is to holding the Congress and the majority in Congress, or to get the majority in Congress. But, what strikes me, Kathleen and Danya, what really strikes me as odd, and I just don't understand it, is Republicans, they message things like immigration and public safety for sure really well. But then you've got Donald Trump, who is, who talks about Hannibal Lecter, like he looks up to him. He praises these dictators. He leans into, supporting Matt Gaetz. He loves Matt Gaetz, who's under the House ethics investigation for, underage, having sex with underage kids. I mean, he leans into his mugshots and being a felon and all of that. And he kind of has thrown out the playbook of what are the things you're supposed to run away from and what are the things you're supposed to embrace. And yet it seems like, he can mock people to their face, and those people will still look at him and support him. It's shocking to me, that the way he treats people, and yet they still support him. And it's almost like he's just giving the middle finger to everybody. I just don't understand it. Why did they bring him to Capitol Hill, the crime scene, right? They brought him to the house, which was the crime scene on January 6th, that he is charged. He's literally charged with trying to obstruct an official proceeding on January 6th. On the House for January 6th, a day that you were there, Kathleen, and in fear for your life, hiding. You shared with us on another episode of MissTrial how you and your colleagues were literally hiding from the rioters. Can you just explain?
You're bringing a really good point. There are no Republicans left who are willing to call January 6th what it was, unless they're already gone. And that's why it was like a hero's welcome. It was bizarre. But I also think that shows you, and we should be worried about this, that they are coalescing around Donald Trump. All the Republicans are coalescing around Donald Trump. There's no separation there. And we have to recognize that they're all in now. And also keep in mind that Donald Trump, just when he presented as a candidate in 2016, he was a reality TV star. He wasn't even like a real estate magnate from blue state New York. The collective opinion about him was, I recognize him. He's that guy from Saying You're Fired on TV, on that reality TV show that everyone loved. And he was that popular because the crazier things that he said made the show that much more popular. So he, I think, is an anomaly when it comes to just saying what he wants to say. In fact, I think he goes out of his way to say crazy things because he knows that's going to rile up his base. And his base is significant. But I think that Joe Biden has a pretty significant base. The question is, what are the people in the middle going to do? What are the people who don't identify as a Republican or a Democrat, aren't willing to answer, a pollster who calls them and says, who are you going to vote for in 2024? Look, I've said this before. When I come back in my next life, I want to be either a weatherman or a pollster because you can get your job wrong 7 days a week and you're still going to have a job. So pollsters are basically, throw their hand up in the air and say, well, this is the information that we're getting. But I think when you dig a little deeper and you go into like focus groups where people are asked actual questions, you have a diverse group of people who are giving you real-time information. That's really where you see it. And that's where people say, honestly, yeah, I do have a problem voting for Donald Trump when he's just been convicted of all these felonies. I have a problem with that. So, but it's still too early to tell. Who knows? But I think the
what is the advice you have for the Democrats? What is the message that we need to get out? Where are the vulnerabilities? Where do you think people care about? I
think that what Democrats should be talking about is, motivating women, because this is not a political issue. This is an issue of autonomy over your own body. Take abortion out of it. Do you have the ability to decide when you want to have a family? Do you have the ability to make healthcare decisions for yourself and not have some judge come in and say, no, you cannot have you're having a miscarriage right now. No, you can't get any medical help in a hospital. Take this pill and go home. That is the reality. What about birth control? Turning that into a controlled substance. This is what we're talking about. And if you're a man who has a sister or a daughter or a wife, how are you not taking this stuff seriously? Forget about choice. Take the politics of abortion out of it. Look at IVF. Look at, birth control. How can Republicans be against abortion and against birth control? What are we talking about here? So to me, that should be a motivating factor. Is it going to be as much of a motivating factor in a state where we don't have to worry about traveling somewhere else if we want to exercise our autonomy over our own body when it comes to a medical decision? That's yet to be seen. But that's what I would be talking about.
What about the Senate? Where's that going?
I mean, look, I think it's whatever happens, it's going to be close. You know, we're going to lose Joe Manchin's seat. There's no question about it. He's the only one that could have kept a seat in West Virginia. But you've got Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin. Oh my gosh, who else do you have? I'm like, you know, Tester in Montana. You've got Sherrod Brown in Ohio. You got Jackie Rosen in Nevada. Just those Tester, Rosen, Brown, and Baldwin. I mean, those are critical races for Democrats. And keep in mind that it's only, you know, we need Kamala Harris to get anything done in the Senate. It's that close. So let's see what happens there. The good news is that most of these candidates are running ahead of Biden in these states. Again, not good news for Joe Biden, but good news for the Senate candidates. And, you know, look, when people would say to me, when I would talk to young people about why it's so important for them to vote, why should it matter to us who the president is? Guess what? Because whomever the president is, they are nominating Supreme Court justices. And I think now, in the past 2 or 3 years, we see why it's so important who a president is, because the court is now 6-3 conservative bent. And the next president, whomever that is going to get at least 1, if not 2 appointments to the Supreme Court. So it matters.
That's a good segue, Karen, for our next topic. Maybe.
Yeah. Okay, so I agree. So I'll talk about the Supreme Court. So the way the Supreme Court works is that they literally hand down all the decisions from a particular term by their time they go out for summer vacation, which usually is in June. And they typically hand down decisions. They call it hand down day, right? I think it's called. They hand down decisions usually on Thursdays. Sometimes they add another day on Fridays. I think there's one other day during the week that they also hand them down. I am certainly not a Supreme Court expert or practitioner. That's a whole other cottage industry of extremely, extremely smart lawyers. But so we are in hand down season, and they're coming in drips and drabs, and everybody is waiting, nail biting for the presidential immunity case, because just to kind of remind everyone where we are, so that when it comes down, everybody can be as informed as possible. This is the case where Jack Smith, the special counsel, indicted Donald Trump only. There were other unindicted co-conspirators, but he's the only defendant in this case. And it was 4 counts, 4 criminal counts that relate to the insurrection on January 6th. And that was before Judge Danya Chutkan. And that case was ready to go to trial. And Donald Trump made an application, a motion before Judge Chutkan, claiming that he's absolutely immune from criminal prosecution, meaning you can't prosecute me. I'm the president of the United States. You cannot criminally prosecute me. And she denied that motion. He appealed before the DC Circuit, and they denied the motion as well. And then he appealed to the United States Supreme Court. Now, Jack Smith tried to skip over and go, if you remember, tried to skip over and get an emergency application before the United States Supreme Court, saying, let's not go to the DC Circuit because time is of the essence. The Supreme Court said, we want it to go to the DC Circuit, and then we want to hear it. And there were oral arguments, and now we're just waiting to see what is going to happen. And the issues that, in particular, that are before the court are a couple of things. Number one, does he have absolute immunity from criminal prosecution? I don't think most people think that they will say that he does, meaning that he can never be prosecuted, or that he can be prosecuted for everything. I don't know that anyone's going to going to hold that either. I think what they're going to do, and what I think most people are going to say, is that he's immune from prosecution for official acts, kind of like Congress is immune from prosecution for under the speech and debate clause, right? In other words, they want to encourage you to do your job. And if you make a mistake while you're doing your job, then you're not immune. And
insurrection. I mean, come on.
well, so that's where it becomes, tricky, right? And even if, because for example, one of the things that the famous quote during the oral arguments at the DC circuit, I think it was Judge Pan who said, who asked about the SEAL Team 6, right? He said, so you're saying with the official acts, you're saying he can't be prosecuted. So if he used SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his enemies, he's commander in chief. That's part of his job description, right? Is he immune from prosecution there? And that was sort of an extreme example. And of course, the answer shouldn't be yes, he shouldn't be allowed to do that. At the same time, if there's a drone strike, for example, and they make a mistake, right? Should he be prosecuted there? So it is a tricky, and the answer is probably no, right? You want a president to be able to make mistakes and not fear criminal prosecution. But so I think most people believe that, and I want to hear what you have to say, what you think, but a lot of people believe the Supreme Court will likely come down with some parsing of the issues, saying certain things you're immune from, certain things you're not. But even if they do that, the practical net effect of this, I don't think will be that he will be immune as candidate Trump, right? Because he was acting as a presidential candidate when he was trying to maintain the presidency. But who knows? Because he was still technically president at that time, despite being a candidate also at the time. The thing that really strikes me about all this is if they do that, then this will most likely be sent back down to Judge Chutkan to make a fact finding about what is official and what's unofficial. And if she has to do that, that's going to delay things even further. That could be subjected to appeal again. I mean, the net effect of all of this is there's not going to be a trial, certainly before the election. And if he wins, there will never be a trial because he will dismiss the cases and pardon himself, right? Certainly he can do both since he'll be in charge of the Department of Justice. One other thing I just want to point out, there's one other Supreme Court decision that we're waiting on that could impact him. And that's Fisher versus the United States. That's one of the January 6th insurrectionists who was prosecuted by the Department of Justice and charged with obstruction of an official proceeding. And if you remember, he was prosecuted in Washington, D.C., and Judge Carl Nickel was the chief judge, I believe, at the time. And he ruled that obstruction of an official proceeding was not an appropriate charge for January 6th because you had to have basically, there's like a document. You had to have done something like torn up the evidence or shredded the papers. That this was a white collar crime that required some affirmative act like that assaulting police officers or breaking into the Capitol is not enough. You have to obstruct an official proceeding. You have to do something tangible like that. And the question will be, Judge Nickel said that ruled that charge was not appropriate. All the other judges in Washington, D.C., who were also district court judges prosecuting other January 6 cases, said it was. It's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court. We'll see what they say. But two of Donald Trump's January 6 charges are obstruction of an official proceeding in violation of 18 United States Code 1512. And the question will be, will that apply to him? I think Jack Smith in his papers have anticipated this and said, well, even if they do rule that way, he was submitting fake elector ballots, fake certificates, that satisfies this other standard that it requires some documents or some kind of paperwork falsification. So hopefully that'll be okay. But again, that'll have to go into motion practice if that is the case. So the net effect is both of these Supreme Court cases have essentially made it so that this case, which was supposed to go before even the Alvin Bragg Manhattan DA case was supposed to go before that, has made it so it's definitely not going to happen before the election. At least that's my take. What about you guys?
I can just jump in real quick, just on recency of fact. We'll just start with the Fisher case, because I wrote an amicus brief about this in the Supreme Court. I think on that, I agree with that analysis, or with Jack Smith's argument. It probably won't affect Trump's indictment, although I agree with you as well that probably that will be the subject of motion practice, but it very well could affect the convictions of dozens and perhaps over 100 convicted defendants. I think this is just to me, this should be open and shut. All these justices on the Supreme Court who are textualists, who really care about what the language says, in most cases, they really look at that and they parse it. If they were to do that in this case, and I won't bore folks with parsing that language here, but it's very clear what it says, and it's not, it is not what Trump's lawyers say it says. So it really shouldn't upset these convictions, but agree that there's some danger, at least based on the questions and body languages of some of the justices. I have a lot to say about the immunity case, but I don't know, Kathleen, if you have anything to say about that.
Just listening to you, Danya, I'm like, so guess what? Forget about the courts. If Donald Trump wins, he's going to pardon all these people. So what difference does it make?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, that's what we're facing. He's going to pardon himself. He's going to.
He always does, the quiet part out loud. He had said as much, right? They're patriots, and they've been unjustly
prisoners.
And there we are. So we know what to expect if he's returned to the presidency. But with respect to the immunity matter, I mean, there obviously is some real concern that whatever the decision is, it will push it back, too far in order to be tried before the election. And it already seems like that's set in stone, no matter what they say. Although I have an interesting thought about that, but put a pin in that, because what was really interesting in the oral argument, I thought, was, of all people, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who asked a really interesting set of questions. As you pointed out, Karen, in the Court of Appeals argument, there was an interesting admission by defense counsel there about the SEAL Team 6 and what that could mean. He said, yeah, he could do that too. And this one, Justice Barrett very expertly, I think, cross-examined the counsel there for Trump and got him, and she really parsed through the indictment and went through the overt acts, right, of the conspiracy or of the charged conduct, and said, well, what about this? Would you agree with me that this is, personal conduct and not conduct, that is official under the presidential powers? And he made some important admissions there. So that's the one possible toehold, perhaps, that if the Supreme Court wanted to make things easier, and they often seem to not to want to do that, but they could say, look, there's no such thing as absolute immunity. I think we all agree, like with everything, Trump goes a step too far. And whereas most people would agree in qualified immunity, he went ahead and said, no, it should be absolute. Chances are they're not going to agree with that. The concern is that they just push it down to back down to District Court Judge Danya Chutkan and say, you decide. But maybe they'll give a set of guidelines that will make it easier and that will streamline the process. But just go back to the pin I threw down earlier. The one possibility where there could be some interesting fact finding, but also exposition of the facts, would be if Judge Chutkan decides to have an evidentiary hearing, like a fact finding hearing, where she, looks at the conduct and makes, findings of fact based on, what they were. Is this personal conduct, or is it within the framework of the presidency? And at that point, there could be witnesses. I mean, she could have, Mike Pence testify. She could have members of Congress testify. Who knows?
Oh my God, Danya, I love that idea. I hadn't even thought of that. That's brilliant. She could have like a mini trial.
Yeah,
to get
so good.
some of this in front of the public, frankly, in a way, and not, not for any cynical reasons. I mean, judges do this all the time. They need, I mean, she could make findings of law, but they're so fact bound, right? They have to be case specific and fact specific. And so it could be that there are witnesses that are put on the stand that actually get some of these facts out in front of the voting public before the election. I think that's the only chance that any of this comes to a head, before November, or significantly ahead of November, that it could be a factor in people's thinking about, what really happened on January 6th, or more to the point, what, the then president's complicity or not was in that conduct.
But Donna, can I just ask, let me just ask you this, like, to me, and I don't know how many people out there feel this way, they expect the Supreme Court, when a case gets to them, for the Supreme Court to rule on it, as opposed to saying, no, but aren't they in effect, I guess my question, Danya, is and Karen, aren't they in effect, by possibly kicking it back down, making a decision, aren't they saying to the public, I know that you guys might want to know this before the election, but we are going to make it impossible for any fact-finding jury to or judge to hold a trial before the election. And isn't that them kind of putting their finger on the scale?
Totally.
In a way?
Totally.
Yeah.
But they're illegitimate. I mean, you've got Clarence Thomas, you've got Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, who was literally part of the insurrection, texting people during the riot. I mean, and he's going to rule on this. You've got Sam Alito, who had an upside down flag at his house, lied about it, by the way, timing wise. And we have a police report. There's a police report about the timing that actually shows that he was either mistaken or lied. But between the time of January 6th and the inauguration, he has an upside down flag, and he's going to rule on this. I mean, I don't think anybody really sees the legitimacy of the court right now. I certainly have lost faith, and it's hard. It's hard for me. I struggle with criticizing judges because you're supposed to revere them, and I always have. But this particular court, and Amy Coney Barrett that you bring up, she's turning out to be more reasonable, I think, than many of us feared on certain issues. She's not necessarily lumping herself in with who knows, too soon to tell, but there've been a few decisions where I'm like, or at least oral arguments where you're thinking, oh, well, maybe there's hope, maybe there's hope for her.
Yeah. Well, we'll maybe know tomorrow where she comes out, and these others are perhaps Friday.
Yeah, but this is an issue, though, honestly, that because if you're like a regular person who has to worry about keeping their job, and, I was having this conversation the other day with someone, I thought, when I was growing up, my father, I think in his whole lifetime, and he lived until he was 89, had 2 jobs his whole life. And now this generation of young people, they're going to have, 13, 14, 15 jobs throughout their entire life. And here's the Supreme Court, some of whom are getting on the Supreme Court in their 40s. And it's a lifetime appointment. And I think because of these rulings that these judges or the Supreme Court is making, it's really shining a light on the fact that this is a lifetime appointment. And there are no ethics rules they're bound by, clearly. They're not going to police themselves. And this is kind of like the Wild, Wild West. And that's not the way people have traditionally viewed the Supreme Court, I don't think.
And imagine if Congress was like that. You had to run for office every 2 years.
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's an ethics committee, much to Matt Gaetz's chagrin at this point. But, we do police ourselves. I'm not saying we always do it well or right, but there's a code of conduct. And I think that, when you're looking to the top court in the land, making decisions that are impacting especially women at this point. I mean, you guys have daughters, I don't understand how women in 2024 find themselves in a worse position from a healthcare standpoint than our mothers and our grandmothers.
Yeah, it's crazy.
terrifying.
It's crazy. Well, I think this is a good segue to the one trial that he was held accountable in the upcoming sentence. But I just need to say, Danya, you're the first person I've heard talk about this, and I absolutely love this idea of a finding hearing that might occur in Washington. So I want to just underscore and repeat that, because I think you're 100% right that this is a possibility, and that's why I love doing this with you guys, because I learned so much from you guys. You're so brilliant, and the idea that we can be on this together and talk about these issues publicly, I just think is incredible, and I'm so grateful. But Danya, take it away and talk to us about the Manhattan DA's office. You represented Michael Cohen through all of this, so it's only fitting that you talk about what's next and what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of important to remember that the case is not over yet. When it refers to Trump as a convicted felon, he has been found guilty by a jury of his peers. He's not a convicted felon until sentencing is passed, which will happen on July 11th. I know that's a silly distinction, but it just puts kind of a fine point on the fact that these proceedings are still live and ongoing. And there has still been quite a bit of activity around. There'll be motion practice, both with respect to what the sentence should be, no doubt with a defense motion for a new trial, which probably will go as well for them as it did when they made it verbally upon the jury's verdict. There's also been a lot of activity around the gag order, which had been put in place by Judge Merchan not too long before the trial, and the judge found was necessary because Trump was out there kind of foaming at the mouth a little bit, including with respect to trial witnesses and with respect to the jurors themselves, which the judge found to be very dangerous. And a lot of people had thought that gag order would expire with the jury's verdict. That is not the case. It doesn't end. It doesn't kind of die its own death. It ends when the judge with jurisdiction lifts it. We were just reminded of that. I think it was yesterday, maybe 2 days ago. I'm on vacation now, so I've kind of lost a little track of time. But the appellate court upheld the gag order. And so I'm found, in the face of an appeal by Trump's lawyers that it was not valid. They disagreed and in pretty cursory fashion found that it was appropriate. So it is still in place unless and until Judge Merchan lifts it. And the Trump camp is making arguments that it should be lifted. And of course, the government will come back with their own arguments. And, I think it's a really interesting question. The jurors certainly are still, in quote unquote danger. And I say that with scare quotes because should their identity be disclosed, there's no question, there have been attempts to dox them. And there's been of course, a tremendous amount of criticism, to put it mildly, about their verdict. And so while overt threats haven't been made, by virtue of the fact that they remain anonymous, certainly one could anticipate that if they were to be de-anonymized. So that's one concern. And of course, there's still the trial witnesses who testified, and the danger to them does not lift with the jury's verdict. I mean, they still, it's both jurors and witnesses. It's one thing for them to be told, okay, you're safe while the trial's happening, but as soon as it's over, sorry, it's kind of out of my hands. If the judge were to say that, I think that would obviously cast a real pall and cause a tremendous amount of concern for witnesses and jurors, willing to serve. So there has been some talk, what will Judge Merchan do? There's some thinking, by pundits and, the kind of chattering classes, that the judge might very well lift it with respect to trial witnesses, particularly witnesses like Michael Cohen and Stormy Daniels, who have been out there talking about the verdict. And I don't know, obviously, what Judge Merchan will do. I found him to be a very experienced, down the line jurist, very smart and truly balanced. I know, others would disagree on Trump's side, but I watched him during trial and I followed the rulings, and I really think he plays it by the books. But I don't think that would. I think that, and I know from my proximity to Michael, that there still is a real danger out there, and that did not lift with the jury's verdict last. When was it? A couple weeks ago already. So and the fact that they're out there talking like there shouldn't be an equivalence. They're not out there motivating people or trying or incentivizing them to commit acts of violence. And we have it is a matter of fact and of record that when Trump talks to his base, they listen. The Attorney General Merrick Garland just wrote an op-ed within the past week in the Washington Post, where he talks about the danger to the rule of law and to specific members of law enforcement when there are, scurrilous rumors and conspiracy theories out there about law enforcement not doing their job, or, this fake news that's the source of the gag order in the Mar-a-Lago case, which we haven't had time to talk about. But, where Trump and others, but Trump himself, out there saying that there was an assassination attempt, essentially, or orders essentially from the Department of Justice to kill him, to use lethal force at the search warrant that was executed in Mar-a-Lago. That's just not true, and that puts actual law enforcement officers in danger. And so we've seen, and we don't even have to get into January 6th to talk about this. We've seen that when Trump talks, folks listen, and it can be dangerous.
Yeah, he said it. He said it at the town hall on Caitlin Collins on CNN. He said, "When my folks listen to you like nobody else." He admitted that, and every judge in their decisions, whether it was Judge Engoron, whether it's Judge Kaplan, Judge Merchan, all the judges where they've had civil and criminal trials, when they make records about threats, et cetera, and the gag orders, Judge Chutkan, they make records of all of this violence that you're talking about. So it's in the record. It's not just his words on a town hall, for sure. You bring up such a good point. And then I want to ask you about sentencing. You bring up such a good point with this Mar-a-Lago thing. I don't think we should not talk about that because you brought it up, and it's just such a great point. Just about what's going on there. Jack Smith asked for a gag order, essentially, because he's putting law enforcement, Trump's putting law enforcement at risk there's a standard boilerplate language in every search warrant. I'm sure every search warrant that you were involved in when you were at the Southern District, Danya, that basically talks about when you can authorize lethal force or not in the execution of search warrant. And it's all about not exercising lethal force, right?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. And for him to turn that around.
Yeah.
He turns it around.
It's bananas. But to Kathleen's point about the Supreme Court and the old saw, justice delayed is justice denied. What Judge Cannon has done here is to just put it off, put it on a lengthy briefing schedule without concern for the real life dangers. Like, what is another? I mean, there have been threats against the FBI, many of them, including one that AG Garland wrote about in his op-ed. It happens, and so she is just content to let it be briefed. And chances are good that she denies the request for the gag order.
Have you ever seen a federal judge behave like her in general? By the way. I mean,
I
just
really
the way
haven't. I mean, you look at Judge Chutkan. Yeah, it's such a sharp contrast, to Judge Chutkan, really. And it's not political. It's really experience. I mean, she asks the most basic questions that she doesn't know the answers to. And it's almost embarrassing for the lawyers to have to explain basic principles of federal criminal law and procedure to her. So it's just even on that level. But here, exactly as Kathleen said, not making a decision is making a decision, perhaps. And, God forbid, there are some consequences, that will be on her, in her conscience. So I pray it doesn't come to that. But yeah, she's having a hearing, I believe next week, that I think will probably shed some more light. She has already said some of the jury instructions she's going to give, and generally those are footnoted, and there's citations to precedent and case law. And here, some of them, she just doesn't do that. Like, for example, she said that she's going to require the jury here to unanimously find what the means and methods of the conspiracy were. That's just not the law. I mean, Judge Merchan ruled the other way in the New York case. And of course he did, because every other judge has done that, because the law is the jury does not. They have to unanimously find all the elements of all the crimes. They don't have to find exactly the way in which a defendant carried out a conspiracy. And so I don't know how to begin to answer that question. I know you don't even, because there's just so many ways in which you could lay out the evidence that she's just not an experienced jurist and is way over her head. But it almost doesn't matter, because she's just putting decisions out there.
Didn't she also just I think before she was appointed by Trump, by the way, should be noted, she had one trial, right? Am I wrong on that? That she had tried one case?
I don't think she ever
know how many.
Yeah,
I'm not sure she did. Just looking at her record here and her decisions, I would say maybe no cases. It really seems out of her depth. And again, this is not a political, accusation at all. I'm, frankly not looking at that. I'm really just looking at the quality of her rulings. And also she pushes everything out, which is just not, just not the way you do it. You need to make pretrial decisions. So, I mean, some of them there could be what's called an interlocutory appeal, right? Which is pending, the trial. But if she pushes out some of these decisions until the trial, there may be no way for those rulings to be appealed. And that's just bananas.
Yeah, no, that's
also, I just wanted to throw out that someone very close to Donald Trump is about to be sent to prison. It has exhausted all his appeals, Steve Bannon. And he literally, talk about saying the quiet part out loud. He named the people that were going to be arrested and prosecuted and thrown in jail if Trump becomes president. Lisa Monaco, Merrick Garland. I mean, it is just unprecedented. I mean, talk about intimidation.
With respect to Bannon, just because it's such a tasty little nugget that has to be said. And, you were talking earlier about your former compatriots on the Hill. I mean, they're freaking out about him going to jail soon, and they're doing everything they can to avoid it. Eventually, if Trump is president, he'll pardon him again, as he did with the former federal prosecution of the We Build the Wall case. But, some of your former colleagues have passed a resolution, or trying to pass a resolution. I don't even know what the status is, but to rescind the subpoena that was issued to him legitimately by the House. Trying to do it.
Mark Meadows and whoever, I think Peter Navarro as well. I mean, I don't even think they have enough Republican support to get that passed. It's just absurd.
But also, look, I don't know, because I haven't studied it. It can't be the case that would undo the indictment, prosecution, conviction, and sentencing. Like, at the time he was tried for that crime, there was a legitimately issued subpoena that, he just didn't honor.
He ignored, right? And what's so but that's what's so awful about it, Danya. That here now the Republicans are saying, well, we're going to undo what they did when they were in charge. Well, you guys issue the same subpoenas. You want the same people. You're trying to hold Merrick Garland, you know what I mean? It's just absurd.
There are motions now that Judge Cannon is going to hear that the special prosecutor was illegitimate, that he never should have been appointed, that's, even though that's been decided many times, all, not in their favor. They're trying it again. But of course, they're not saying that the special counsel that was appointed to prosecute Hunter Biden, or the one who looked at President Biden's handling of classified information, those aren't illegitimate, but this one was. It just, I mean, talk about, two-tiered system of justice. If the law and the rules and the procedures should all go in the same direction and they should apply uniformly. And that is the meaning of the rule of law. It's a rule. It's not a fuzzy set of ideas that you can apply or not.
Right.
Rule.
Right.
It's true.
So-
It's true. But somehow that's what kills. This is getting back to what we were saying before. This is what the Republicans somehow, they do it that way and they get away with it. And I don't understand it. Right. It's like the Democrats can't do this, whatever, but we can, and I just don't get it. I don't get this double standard and why they keep winning, or why they win at all, I should say. It just makes no sense.
It remains to be seen.
So let's talk about the sentence that's coming up. What do you think the DA's office is going to ask for? What do you think they should ask for? And what do you think the judge is going to do? I'd love to hear. I mean, Kathleen in particular.
What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, look, I worked in the office, but I was never, I always thought, heavy is the head who wears the crown, right? It's easy for me as I was a prosecutor, right? I worked there, and it's easy for me to make arguments, et cetera. I didn't have to answer to an electorate the way you did, Kathleen, when you were before you were a member of Congress, you were the elected district attorney for Nassau County in Long Island here in New York. What are some of the factors that go into determining a sentence like this? And what would you ask for? Because Alvin Bragg is going to be intimately involved in this. Like, what would you kind of say?
Well, as well he should, because basically, well, first of all, you try to put every defendant in the same position. Like, you take into consideration their background, the severity of the crime, and what the potential sentence may be. I don't think that Alvin Bragg can win in this situation, right? Because the Republicans are talking about two-tier system of justice. But if they really want a one-tier system of justice, Donald Trump's going to jail, right? I mean, if you really want to say, okay, there's one system of justice, everyone should be treated the same, Donald Trump would go to jail. But because of who he is a former and potential future president. I think these things have to be taken a little, maybe slightly with a little more nuance, and ultimately the judge is going to have a lot to say about it. The recommendation from the DA is just that. They're going to recommend, obviously, probation, the probation department. They've already begun their interviews with him. They've already interviewed him. They're going to make their recommendation. I think it's unlikely that he's going to get a prison sentence, but I don't know, house arrest. I mean, Danya, I'd love to hear what you think about this, but I think that Alvin Bragg is in a very difficult position, but, he has an ability to say to the Republicans, you're right. There should not be two systems of justice. And that's why we tried this case. That's why we brought this case. That's why we tried this case. And that's why we're going to ask for the sentence that we're asking for, and kind of hoist them by their own petard. But your thoughts, Danya?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I've looked at hundreds of light cases. So an important consideration for the judge is to avoid sentencing disparities, both within the case itself and any other co-conspirators. And we'll talk about Michael Cohen in 1 second. And then across the board, right, between cases. So other instances where other defendants have been convicted of the same crime. So here, these are all 32 of these counts are Class E felonies, where the judge could impose a sentence of up to 4 years. And so each of the parties are going to be arguing, Trump will be arguing for no jail time, nothing at all. And we'll see. It's such an interesting conundrum almost for the DA's office. I suspect they will ask for some time because if you're looking at, first of all, Michael Cohen, who was sentenced to 36 months, 3 years for exactly the same conduct. Granted, that was in federal court, but on those 2 counts with respect to Karen McNougal and Stormy Daniels, he got 36 months. And he's, I would say, not even arguably, he was a kind of subordinate in the scheme. It was all in service of Donald Trump. So he's, judge also will look at roles, right, that different co-conspirators played. And here clearly the beneficiary was Trump. So the court will likely look at that, and then he'll look at other folks who were convicted of the same crime. And a lot of them who go to trial, which is their right to do, but they are not accepting responsibility. And this one in particular has had absolutely no remorse and has really come after, other players in the system and the judge. And, other defendants get jail time. So, here the judge will look at both offense characteristics, Trump was this happened over a long period of time. He was the beneficiary. This wasn't a snap decision. It interfered with an election. He'll look at all those things. He'll also look at the offender characteristics. Who is the defendant? What has his life been like before? Has he committed any other bad acts or crimes? Was this aberrational? Is he a charitable person? What's his upbringing like? What's his mental and physical health? They really look at all that, and the judge will look at mitigating factors, aggravating factors. And, at the end of the day, if this were like any other case, I would suspect he would get a short prison sentence because this is a former president. And Judge Merchan has said in the context of the gag order how reluctant he is to put this guy in prison. He has already said that. So we have a little bit of a window into his thinking about it. I think it would be, I would be shocked, truly, if he gets any kind of a real jail sentence. Like, I think there will be something, that will not be a slap on the wrist. I don't know if it's, home confinement for some period of time, and it could be intermittent or episodic, where it doesn't have to be 5 months of home confinement. It could be on weekends or when you're not doing campaign stops. There's a lot of creative sentencing solutions that the judge could come up with to fit this particular defendant, which is what the judge is supposed to do. But I suspect it will not just be, okay, you're done, not even a slap on the wrist, you can go home or you can continue your campaigning. I think there'll be some consequence for this defendant, is my personal view, but obviously, and anyone's guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, I thought.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that if you look at the rhetoric coming from the former president about election interference, all of this, I mean, can you imagine what he's going to say if he is actually confined and can't campaign? Now, I'm not saying that's any kind of a consideration that a judge or anyone else should take into account. But like, that's what we're faced with. And I mean, these are really, if you just take him, as a former president, not running, it's fraught with all of these considerations. Throw him in as the Republican candidate for president, not just likely candidate for, he is the Republican candidate for president. And I think that, again, not to say that should influence anything, but can you imagine the rhetoric that we're going to hear? If just his job.
Yeah. I mean, except, he decided to run for president as a get out of jail free card. I mean, and now he's benefiting himself from that, putting that aside. Look, I've thought a lot about what an appropriate sentence would be here. And I, in the beginning, thought, what would be really great would be if he were sentenced to a conditional discharge and had to, community service, had to pick up trash in the subway and, that kind of stuff. The way anyone else who gets community service, like hundreds of hours of that, wouldn't that would be actual punishment to him, a fine, he's rich, so that wouldn't be a punishment. And all the issues with confinement that you talked about. But then I started thinking kind of what you both just said about how if you treated him like anyone else, although this is not a mandatory prison sentence, when you look at the underlying conduct of people who are also convicted of falsifying business records in the first degree, when you look at the ones who were sentenced to prison, many of them, the facts are what matters, right? The egregiousness of the crime. And frankly, I can't imagine a more serious crime than this one, right? The jury had to find unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt that the reason that they falsified the business records was in order to interfere with the election, right? To commit a state election crime. They had to find that beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, as you said, the means and methods, the unlawful means, how they did that, That's the issue that I think everyone is up in arms about. What's the crime? What did they say? But they essentially, what I think, though, given the severity of it and that this was all about stealing an election, I think he's going to sentence him to prison. Look, he's an adjudicated rapist, right? Although it's civil, still. He was an adjudicated fraudster, also civil. He has been found to have lied, cheated, and stolen in business all across New York. He's got 3 pending indictments. I mean, the guy was held in contempt 10 times during this trial. I think the judge is going to sentence him to prison, and I think he's going to stay the sentence pending appeal. That way he doesn't go in. He gets to campaign. He gets to go through the election, see what happens. And obviously, if he wins, he's not going to be incarcerated because he can't. There's a whole supremacy clause, a separation of powers, and the United States Constitution standing in the way of a state court judge being able to incarcerate him while he has to carry out his duties as president of the United States. So, but if he loses, I think if this survives appeal, I think he goes in. That's what I think the judge might do. That's where I've landed. But I know that we need to wrap this up. Anything else anyone wants to say before we?
One thing, as your lawyer, Karen, he was not convicted of rape. It was sexual assault. And he has come after people for defamation for saying that he was found guilty or liable for rape. So I would represent you, of course. I'd be happy to take that on.
Well, Judge I know you're right. He was adjudicated for sexual assault. You're right. But Judge Kaplan did say in everywhere else in the country, it is a quirk of New York law that what he did is not considered rape, that colloquially this is considered rape. So I still stand by. I think I have a defense.
She's going to be a difficult client, Danya.
I know, difficult client, but I appreciate that you will.
Call in for new business.
I do appreciate that you will represent me.
But everything else you said, it's interesting. We get to a different place. I said I'd be shocked if there's jail term, but everything you said makes so much sense up until that point. It's just maybe like so many things with Trump, it's unfathomable. The verdict was exactly what it should have been. And all along I was saying, he's going to found guilty. I was still shocked, right? Because he's just skated so many times on so many things. But we'll see in less than a month, right? On July 11th. So stay tuned.
Yes, absolutely. Stay tuned. Well, guys, I love this. I love that we do this together. And this is so much fun. So stay tuned for another episode of MissTrial.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the Midas Touch newsletter at MidasTouch.com/newsletter.